Are you listening alone tonight? Because what you're about to hear might make you grateful for the company. If you're ready for a tale that will chill you to the bone, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. And please let me know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. I'm curious to see how far this dark tale will travel. Now let me take you back to the rugged coast of Maine, to a year when the salt spray carried more than just the scent of the sea, and the millstones ground more than just timber. The autumn of 1873 was particularly harsh in the small, isolated town of Blackwood, Maine. 37 souls vanished from the logging trails and coastal roads leading to the town, and not a single body was ever found. The local authorities blamed the unforgiving wilderness, the treacherous Atlantic storms, even the road bears said to roam the thick pines. But the truth was far more disturbing. What the town elders desperately tried to hide for over a century was this. Every one of those missing souls had last been seen heading toward the Hartwell brothers' sawmill on Blackwood Creek, where the massive circular blades never stopped turning, day or night, even when there was no timber to cut. The morning mist still clung to Blackwood Creek when young Caleb Thorne made his discovery. A discovery that would unravel the most horrific secret in Maine's industrial history. Blackwood was the kind of town that embodied everything resilient about New England in the 1870s. Nestled between towering forests and the unforgiving ocean, it boasted a population of nearly 900 souls, lumberjacks, fishermen, shipbuilders, and their families who had carved out a tough existence from the rocky soil and swift-flowing streams. The main street, little more than a muddy track, ran parallel to Blackwood Creek, lined with rough-hewn cabins and a few sturdier homes, their small gardens battling against the elements. The sparse, unpainted meeting house, with its squat steeple, stood at the town's heart, its bell tolling mournfully across the inlet every Sunday. The town's pride, and its grim necessity, was its industry. 2 fish canneries that filled the air with the sharp tang of brine and fish oil. A small boatyard where the constant hammer of caulking irons echoed. A general store, smelling of molasses and lamp oil. And most importantly, the Hartwell brothers' sawmill, which had been processing timber from the vast inland forests since 1852. The rhythm of commerce flowed like the tide itself, logging teams bringing their wagons, heavy with pine and spruce, leaving with scant coin for their perilous work. Fishing schooners docking with their catches, hoping for a fair price. The mill sat like a dark beast of timber and stone where Blackwood Creek emptied into a sheltered cove. Its massive water wheel, nearly 30 feet in diameter, turned with a relentless rhythm that locals said you could hear even over the roar of a nor'easter. The building itself stood 3 stories tall, its unpainted clapboard sides dark with age and moisture, windows that caught the dim light like vacant eyes. The shriek of its massive saw blades carried for miles on still days, a piercing wail that had become as much a part of the cove's soundscape as the gulls or the crashing waves. Inside, the mill was a marvel of rough ingenuity. Heavy iron gears, lubricated with fish oil, transferred power from the water wheel to the colossal circular saws. Thick leather belts ran to auxiliary equipment, log carriages, planing machines, sawdust conveyors. The smell of fresh-cut pine permeated everything, settling into clothes and hair, marking anyone who worked there with the distinctive scent of honest, if brutal, labor. The main saw blades, imported from England at tremendous expense, were made of hardened steel, capable of tearing through the thickest trunks with terrifying speed. Elijah and Silas Hartwell had inherited the mill from their father, old Jedediah Hartwell, who'd built it with his own calloused hands and a loan from a Boston merchant. Jedediah had been a stern pillar of the community, a deacon for 20 years, a man who read his Bible daily and insisted his workers observe the Sabbath. His rough-hewn portrait still hung in the mill office, those grim eyes seeming to judge all who entered. Where Jedediah had been a God-fearing man who closed the mill on Sundays and donated sparingly to the meeting house, his sons were cut from different cloth. Elijah, the elder at 48, was a mountain of a man with hands like gnarled oak and eyes the color of a winter sea. Standing 6 feet 2 inches in his heavy boots, he seemed to fill every doorway in town. His coarse black hair, now threaded with white, was always slicked back with lard. He handled the business side, negotiating prices with a shrewdness that bordered on outright theft, managing accounts with ruthless precision, collecting debts with a persistence that bordered on cruelty. Local loggers knew better than to be late with payments. Elijah had been known to seize entire timber claims over debts as small as a few dollars. Silas, younger by 7 years, was the mechanical genius. Thin as a rail with restless hands that never stopped moving. He could coax that mill to run smoother than silk, knew every gear and shaft and blade by touch alone. Where Elijah was stone, Silas was quicksilver, constantly in motion, muttering to himself about torque and blade speeds, sketching mechanical improvements on any available surface. He'd briefly worked in a shipyard in Portland before their father's death called him home, and he brought back ideas about efficiency and raw power that he applied obsessively to the mill's operation. The brothers had never married. Married to the mill, folks would whisper, though not within earshot. There had been talk years ago of Elijah courting a schoolteacher from Bangor, but nothing came of it. Some said she'd taken one look at those cold, unyielding eyes and fled back to city society. Silas had never shown interest in anything that didn't have gears or could cut timber. They lived in the house their father built, a squat, unpainted structure that overlooked the mill from a small rise, its windows dark and uninviting. The meager gardens their mother had tended were now choked with weeds and salt-water-resistant brambles. They kept to themselves mostly, emerging only for business or their bi-weekly trip to O'Malley's general store for supplies. Elijah would stride down the main track every Tuesday at precisely 10 o'clock, acknowledging greetings with the barest nod, his heavy boots marking a steady rhythm on the packed earth. Silas rarely left the mill at all, preferring to send his brother on any necessary errands. When he did venture into town, he walked with quick, nervous steps, his eyes darting constantly, as if calculating the structural integrity of every building he passed. The townspeople had learned to accept the brothers' peculiarities. After all, the Hartwell mill was the economic heart of Blackwood. It employed 15 men directly, millwrights, loggers, teamsters, and supported dozens more indirectly. Fishermen depended on it for their lobster traps and boat repairs. Merchants profited from the trade it brought to town. The mill's timber was known throughout the region for its quality, strong, straight, and consistent. Orders came from as far away as Boston and even beyond. The summer of 1873 had been good to Blackwood. The cod haul was excellent, filling the canneries to bursting. The timber yield from the deep forests was the best in memory, towering pines stretching towards the sky like a vast, green army. The 4th of July celebration had been particularly grand, with a small steamship from Portland bringing fireworks and a traveling fiddler. There was talk of progress everywhere. The new telegraph line was supposed to reach them by 1875, which would connect them to the outside world. The town meeting had approved funds for a new schoolhouse, and Dr. Agnes Miller from Boston was considering setting up practice in town, a remarkable feat for a woman in such a remote place. The social fabric of Blackwood was tightly woven. Everyone knew everyone else's business, from the mayor's missing fishing nets to the widow McLeod's scandalous letters from a sailor in Liverpool. The women's sewing circle met every Thursday to mend fishing nets and quilt for the poor. The whaling society held rallies monthly, though their impact was limited given the declining whale population. Young people courted under watchful eyes at meeting house socials and harvest feasts. Life moved with the seasons, fishing, logging, preserving, and the long, brutal winters when the mill would run continuously, processing the stored timber while snow piled deep against its walls. But beneath this veneer of prosperity and progress, there were whispers of older things. The oldest residents remembered stories their grandparents had told about the bend in Blackwood Creek where the mill stood. The local Penobscot Indians had avoided that spot, claiming the water ran red there on certain nights. There were tales of strange lights seen in the cove during the new moon and of sounds that weren't quite the creek or the wind. Most dismissed these as superstition, the detritus of a less enlightened age. But sometimes, on foggy nights, when the water wheel turned and the saws shrieked their endless song, even the most rational citizens would quicken their pace when passing by. As autumn approached in that year of 1873, the leaves beginning their slow burn from green to gold and crimson, something changed in Blackwood. It started with the strangers, always a noteworthy event in a town where everyone knew everyone else's lineage back 5 generations, but these weren't the usual itinerant fishermen or trappers. These were solitary figures, here one day and gone the next, leaving no trace but questions, and as it would turn out, a terrible absence. The first to go missing was a trapper named Jebediah Stone, though nobody realized it at the time. He'd come into town on September 10th with his small haul of furs and a thirst for cheap rum, making his usual rounds. Martha Higgins, who ran the boarding house, remembered him specifically because he complained about the price of beaver pelts. Said he was heading up to the Hartwell mill before dark. He wanted to see if they needed any pine tar for their machinery. I warned him those brothers didn't take kindly to strangers, she would later tell the constable. But he just laughed. Said he'd dealt with tougher men than country millers. Stone's traps and rifle were found 3 days later, abandoned on an old logging trail 2 miles north of town. His sled dog was tied peacefully nearby, still whimpering for its master. The traps were untouched, all his furs accounted for. Even his small pouch of tobacco remained. But Jebediah Stone was gone. The only strange thing, according to Constable Silas Finch, was the fine sawdust covering everything, as if someone had emptied a sack of fresh-cut wood shavings over the entire area. The second disappearance happened just a week later. Mary Beth Chalmers, a young woman of 19 from the neighboring fishing village of Port's End, had been visiting her aunt in Blackwood. On the evening of September 17th, she'd left her aunt's house just after 9 o'clock, promising to return the following morning. The quickest route back to Port's End led past the Hartwell mill. I begged her to take the longer main road, her aunt would sob to Constable Finch, but she said the moon was bright and she'd save half an hour by the creek path. Said she wasn't afraid of the dark like a child. And Mary Beth never made it home. Her family searched for 3 days before finding her shawl caught on a splintered log near the mill's tail race, that channel where the water flows after turning the wheel. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, nothing but that shawl and, oddly, more of that fine sawdust, almost like snow on the surrounding leaves. By the time the third person vanished, a traveling preacher named Reverend Jeremiah Finch, who'd been delivering sermons on the evils of rum to little avail, people were beginning to whisper. The whispers turned to worried murmurs when the fourth and fifth disappeared on the same night, a married couple, the O'Connells, who'd been returning from visiting relatives in Bangor. Constable Finch, a pragmatic man who'd served on a whaling ship, began to see a pattern. He spread out a crude map on his desk and marked each disappearance with a lead pencil. Everyone had last been seen on the roads or trails near the Hartwell mill. Everyone had vanished between dusk and dawn, and at every scene where belongings were found, there was that cursed sawdust. On October 1st, Finch decided to pay the Hartwell brothers a visit. The mill was running when he arrived just after noon, the ceaseless shriek of the saws vibrating through the ground. He found Elijah in the office, a cramped room that smelled of sawdust and stale pipe tobacco. The miller looked up from his ledgers with those sea-gray eyes, showing no surprise at the constable's presence. "Afternoon, Silas," Elijah said, his voice as flat as his expression. "Come about the missing folks, I expect." Finch nodded. 5 people gone in 3 weeks, Elijah. All of them last seen in this vicinity. "Dangerous roads hereabouts," Elijah replied, returning to his figures. "Especially after dark. Forests are thick this year. Man could wander off, get lost, end up in the Atlantic before anyone noticed. Bodies would wash ashore somewhere. Always do." Elijah's pencil paused for just a moment. "Not always. Current's tricky near the cove." Finch studied the miller's face, searching for something, guilt, fear, knowledge. He found only that blank, impassive stare. "Mind if I look around?" "Mill's a dangerous place for those who don't know it," Elijah said. "Wouldn't want the law getting hurt on my property. Silas is particular about strangers near his machinery." "I'll be careful." Elijah shrugged. "Suit yourself. Just stay clear of the cutting floor when the saws are running." "And Silas," the constable turned back, "you might want to solve these disappearances quick. Bad for business, all this talk. People might start taking their timber elsewhere." Finch spent 2 hours searching the mill. He found nothing unusual. Stacks of raw logs, piles of milled lumber, the massive saws shrieking away with their endless hunger. Silas watched him from the shadows, never speaking, those nervous hands constantly adjusting levers and gears. The younger Hartwell's eyes followed Finch's every move with an intensity that made the constable's skin crawl. But it wasn't until Finch was leaving that he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The main circular saws, massive steel blades, each over 10 feet in diameter, were running empty, no logs feeding through the carriage. Yet they shrieked on, steel against air, producing that fine dust that coated everything. "Why are you running empty saws?" Finch asked Silas, who had materialized beside him like a ghost. The younger brother's mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. "Sharpening," he said, his voice like rustling leaves. "Got to keep them sharp. Got to keep them hungry." That night, unable to shake his unease, Finch stationed himself on a rocky bluff overlooking the mill. He'd told his wife he was checking on a reported bear sighting, but in truth, he wanted to watch the Hartwell mill after dark. What he saw made him question his own sanity. "Just want to remind you, if this story is giving you the creeps, hit that like button. It really helps other mystery lovers find these tales." And drop a comment with your theory about what the Hartwell brothers were really doing in that mill. Now let's return to that terrible night when Constable Finch saw something that would haunt him forever. The mill ran all night, which wasn't unusual during the peak logging season. What was unusual was the traffic. Finch counted 3 wagons approaching the mill between midnight and 3 o'clock in the morning. They came with no lanterns, moving through the darkness with practiced ease. Each wagon was heavy loaded, canvas covered, and each left empty an hour later. But it was what happened at 3 o'clock that truly shook him. By late October, 37 souls had vanished from the roads and trails around Blackwood. The town was gripped by a fear that transcended the rational. Logging teams began traveling in groups, armed with axes and rifles. The coastal schooners added extra crew. Families barred their doors at sunset and kept lanterns burning all night. The Hartwell mill continued its ceaseless shrieking. Reverend Elijah Morgan called for days of prayer and fasting. Some of the more superstitious folk began leaving offerings at the old Penobscot marker stone near Blackwood Creek. Dried fish and tobacco, as their ancestors had done during the hungry times of 1816. But mostly, people just stayed away from the mill road after dark. It was young Caleb Thorne who finally uncovered the truth, though he nearly paid for that knowledge with his life. Caleb was 16, the son of the town's fisherman, with more curiosity than sense. He'd been sweet on Hannah Davies, whose family farm lay on the other side of Blackwood Creek from the mill. Despite his parents' strict prohibition, he'd been sneaking out to see her, taking the long way around to avoid the mill road. On the night of October 28th, a thick fog rolled in from the Atlantic, blanketing the valley in gray wool. Caleb, emboldened by the cover it provided, decided to take the shorter route past the mill. He reasoned that in such fog even the Hartwell brothers wouldn't see him passing. He was wrong. The fog muffled sounds, turning the world into a realm of shadows and whispers. Caleb could hear the water wheel turning, that steady splash and creak, and the piercing shriek of the saws. But as he crept along the path, other sounds reached his ears, voices, low and urgent, and the thud of something heavy being dragged across wood. Caleb crept closer, his heart hammering against his ribs. Through the fog, he could see lamplight glowing from the mill's loading dock. Shadows moved against the light, the unmistakable silhouettes of the Hartwell brothers. But there was something else. Something that made Caleb's mouth go dry as dust. They were unloading a wagon, but not timber. The shapes were wrong. Too long, too limp, wrapped in canvas. As Caleb watched, frozen in horror, one of the bundles slipped from Silas's grip. A leg fell free of the wrapping, pale in the lamplight, a worn boot still on the foot. Caleb must have made a sound, a gasp, a whimper, because suddenly Elijah's head snapped up, those gray eyes scanning the fog. "Someone's watching," the elder brother said, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "The fog's thick," Silas replied, but his nervous hands had stilled. "No one travels on a night like this." "Someone is." Caleb didn't wait to hear more. He ran, stumbling through the fog, brambles tearing at his clothes, expecting at any moment to feel Elijah's iron hands close around his throat. He ran until his lungs burned, until he collapsed in the doorway of his father's cabin, sobbing and retching. The story he gasped out to his father would have been dismissed as a nightmare had not Caleb's clothes been torn and muddy, his face scratched by branches. And in his trembling hand, he clutched something he'd snagged during his flight, a piece of coarse canvas, stained with what looked terribly like dried blood. Samuel Thorne was a practical man, a fisherman who'd seen death on the high seas, but he was also a father. He loaded his harpoon gun, barred the door, and sat up all night with his terrified son. At first light, he sent Caleb to Constable Finch while he rode to Bangor to fetch the county sheriff. By noon, a posse of 25 men had assembled. They surrounded the mill just as Elijah was emerging for his weekly trip to the general store. The elder Hartwell surveyed the armed men with no more emotion than if they'd been a flock of gulls. "Gentlemen," he said calmly, "to what do I owe this visit?" Sheriff Bartholomew Reed, a veteran lawman who'd seen his share of violence in the timber camps, stepped forward. "Elijah Hartwell, you and your brother are under arrest on suspicion of murder." "Murder?" Elijah's eyebrows rose slightly. "Who am I supposed to have murdered?" "We'll start with the 37 people who've gone missing these past weeks." "Missing people aren't murdered people, Sheriff. Show me a body." "We intend to," Reed replied grimly, "starting with a search of your mill." For the first time, something flickered in Elijah's eyes. Not fear exactly, but calculation. "You have a warrant." "Don't need one. This many missing people. I have cause to search every building in the county." Elijah's jaw tightened, but he stepped aside. Silas won't like strangers touching his machinery. Then he'd better cooperate. What they found in the mill's lower levels defied comprehension. The cutting room seemed normal enough at first glance, the massive saws turning slowly, the air thick with sawdust. But Silas Finch, remembering his earlier visit, checked the log carriage, empty. Yet the saws shrieked on. "Stop the wheel!" Sheriff Reed ordered. Silas, who'd been watching from the stairs with those nervous, darting eyes, shook his head. "Can't. Won't. The blades must feed. Stop it, or we'll break it." It was Elijah who finally nodded to his brother. With obvious reluctance, Silas threw the lever that disengaged the wheel. The mill shuddered to a stop, the sudden silence almost painful after the constant shriek. "Now," Reed said, "remove the main blade." The Hartwell brothers exchanged a look that sent chills down Finch's spine. "That blade weighs near a ton," Elijah said quietly. "Take special equipment to lift it. Then you'd better get started." It took 4 hours and all the mill's lifting gear to raise the massive main circular blade. As it slowly rose on chains and pulleys, an ungodly smell began to fill the air, sweet and corrupt, like spoiled meat mixed with pine resin. Several men had to step outside to vomit. What lay beneath the blade was worse than anyone had imagined. The saw bed, that stationary lower platform, had modified. Instead of the normal pattern of grooves that channeled sawdust away, deeper channels had been cut, all leading to a central pit. And caught in those channels, ground into the very wood itself, were fragments of things that should never have been in a sawmill. Bone shards, teeth, scraps of cloth, a fisherman's brass button crushed flat, a pocket watch, its face cracked, hands frozen at 2:43. "Dear God," someone whispered. But that wasn't the worst of it. The central pit led to a chute, and the chute led down into the mill's foundation. When they broke through the floor to follow it, they found a series of chambers carved from the bedrock itself. Some were empty. Others. Sheriff Reed would later write in his official report that they found evidence of at least 43 individuals in those chambers. The bodies, what remained of them, had been systematically processed, the flesh stripped away, the bones sorted, some ground to powder by the saws above, others stacked like cordwood in the deepest chamber. And on the walls, carved in Silas's nervous hand, were tallies, names and dates going back not weeks or months, but years. The earliest date was 1853, just 1 year after the brothers had inherited the mill. 20 years of murder. 20 years of grinding human bones into the sawdust that coated the lumber sold throughout the region. The arrest of the Hartwell brothers sent shock waves through Maine and beyond. Newspapers from Boston to Montreal carried the story, each more sensational than the last. The Blackwood Butchers, they called them, though there was no evidence the brothers had engaged in that particular horror. Under interrogation, the truth emerged in pieces, like a puzzle assembled from nightmare. It had started, Elijah claimed, by accident. A vagrant had tried to steal from them in the winter of 1853, breaking into the mill office where they kept their strongbox. Silas had surprised the man, and in the struggle, the thief had fallen into the open saw pit, breaking his neck. "We should have reported it," Elijah told Sheriff Reed with that same flat effect. "But times were hard. We owed money to the bank. Creditors were pressing. And Silas, he said, why waste good bone meal?" The younger brother had remembered something from their father's time, how during the terrible winter of 1816, the year without summer, people had used ground bone as fertilizer to enrich the poor soil. Nutrient, Silas reasoned. And bones, when ground fine enough, added strength to the lumber, made it more durable. Just that once, Elijah insisted, to get through the winter. No one would know. The saws would cut anything to dust. But once they'd crossed that line, there was no going back. The mill's lumber became known for its quality, strong as oak, straight as a mast, with a resilience that made ships sturdier and homes stand longer. Orders increased, profits soared, and the brothers found they needed more. Raw material. They became selective. Travelers no one would miss, drifters, trappers, loggers heading inland who wouldn't be expected anywhere specific. For 20 years they'd maintained their terrible harvest, taking just enough to supplement their regular milling, never enough to arouse suspicion. But this year, Elijah explained, his voice finally showing cracks, Silas got greedy, or maybe mad. He said the saws were hungry, always hungry, said we needed to feed them more. The acceleration of disappearances in 1873 was Silas's doing. He developed a taste for it, Elijah claimed. Not for the killing itself, but for the mechanics of it, the efficiency, the way a human body could be reduced to its component parts, processed, utilized. Nothing wasted. He kept journals, Elijah said. And indeed, they found them. 3 leather-bound volumes filled with Silas's cramped handwriting. Detailed notes on processing times, bone-to-lumber ratios, optimal cutting speeds for different densities. The journals read like technical manuals, devoid of emotion or acknowledgement that the material had once been human. But perhaps the most chilling discovery came from the financial ledgers. The brothers had kept meticulous records of their lumber sales, and when investigators cross-referenced dates, they found that shipments of the special blend lumber, supplemented with human bone meal, had gone to shipbuilders and carpenters throughout the region. For 20 years, the people of Blackwood and surrounding towns had unknowingly lived in homes built with, and sailed on ships crafted from, the remains of the missing. The trial of the Hartwell brothers became the most sensational legal proceeding in Maine history. The courthouse in Portland overflowed with spectators, journalists, and curiosity seekers. Vendors sold Hartwell mill souvenirs outside, miniature saw blades, small bags of pure sawdust, even photographs of the brothers in their cell. Elijah maintained his stoic demeanor throughout, answering questions in that same flat voice, showing emotion only when discussing the mill's mechanical operations. He seemed genuinely puzzled by the moral outrage, as if he couldn't understand why people were upset about what he saw as a practical solution to economic hardship. Silas, on the other hand, deteriorated rapidly in custody. Separated from his beloved machinery, his nervous energy turned inward. He would sit for hours moving his hands, as if adjusting invisible levers and gears, muttering about cutting rates and blade alignment. By the time the trial began, he was deemed incompetent to stand trial and was committed to the Maine State Hospital for the Insane in Augusta. The prosecution presented a devastating case. Caleb Thorne testified about what he'd seen that foggy night. Constable Finch described his investigations and growing suspicions. A parade of relatives identified personal effects found in the mill's terrible chambers: rings, watches, buttons, scraps of clothing. But it was the testimony of Dr. Eleanor Vance, brought in from Bowdoin College, that truly horrified the jury. She had examined the remains found in the mill and confirmed not only their human origin, but also the systematic nature of their processing. This was not random violence, she stated. This was industrial murder. The bodies were processed with the same efficiency as timber, reduced to their useful components with mechanical precision. I have seen battlefield casualties, gentlemen. I have performed countless autopsies, but I have never seen human beings reduced to inventory. The defense, such as it was, relied on pleas of economic necessity and mental deficiency. Elijah's lawyer argued that the brothers had been driven to extremity by poverty, that their actions, while regrettable, were those of desperate men trying to save their family legacy. He pointed out that they had never killed for pleasure or passion, only for profit. It was a losing argument. On December 12, 1873, after just 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on 43 counts of murder. Elijah Hartwell was sentenced to hang. But the story didn't end with the verdict. In the weeks following the trial, strange events began to plague Blackwood. It started with the timber. Every household in the valley began to examine their wooden structures with growing horror. Was this beam made before the arrests? How could they tell? Some families burned their entire homes. Others attempted to return lumber to merchants who refused it, having no way to verify its purity. The economic impact was immediate and devastating. Shipyards closed. The logging market collapsed. Farmers couldn't sell their firewood at any price. The 2 remaining mills in the area saw their business vanish overnight. As rumors spread that the Hartwell brothers' practices were an industry-wide secret, then came the illnesses, whether from psychological suggestion or some darker cause. People throughout the valley began reporting mysterious ailments, bone aches, nightmares, strange growths. A fisherman in Port's End swore he could taste rust in his drinking water. A child in Blackwood claimed his wooden toys whispered to him at night, though examination showed only ordinary pine. Dr. Vance was called back from Bowdoin to investigate. She found no physical cause for the ailments, but noted the profound psychological trauma affecting the entire region. They have discovered they were unwitting participants in a vile communion, she wrote in her journal. The horror of it has poisoned not just their bodies, but their minds. But there were other incidents that couldn't be explained by mass hysteria. The Hartwell mill, sealed by court order pending demolition, began showing signs of activity. Neighbors reported lights moving through the windows at night. The water wheel, which had been locked in place, was found turning one morning, though the water gates remained closed. Most unsettling of all, people passing the mill claimed to hear the saws shrieking, that piercing wail that had once been the heartbeat of the town. Constable Finch, promoted to sheriff after Reed's retirement, the old lawman claimed the case had aged him 10 years, investigated these reports personally. He found no sign of human intrusion, but he did find something that chilled him to the bone. Fresh sawdust on the cutting room floor, as if the saws had been running just moments before. Impossible, he muttered, checking the massive main blade. It remained locked in its raised position, chains taut, exactly as it had been left after the investigation. Yet the sawdust was there, fine as ever, coating every surface. The town council, desperate to move past the horror, voted to demolish the mill immediately rather than wait for spring as planned. But when the work crew arrived on a cold January morning, they made a horrifying discovery. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Blackwood intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. Silas Hartwell was there. The younger brother had escaped from the asylum 3 days earlier, though the authorities hadn't yet connected that escape to Blackwood. How he'd traveled 70 miles in winter, barefoot and wearing only his asylum clothes, no one could explain. But there he was, standing before the saws, his nervous hands moving over the machinery with loving familiarity. "Can't stop," he said when Sheriff Finch approached, gun drawn. "The saws are hungry. Always hungry. Father knew. Elijah knew. You'll know too." Silas had somehow started the mill despite the water gates being closed. Despite the wheel being locked, the saws were shrieking, producing that fine dust that filled the air like fog. But cutting what? The log carriages were empty, had been empty since the arrests. "Silas," Finch said carefully, "step away from the saws." The younger Hartwell brother turned, and Finch saw that whatever sanity had remained to him was gone. His eyes were bright with fever, his lips cracked and bleeding, his hands raw from working the frozen controls. "Do you know what we discovered, Sheriff?" Silas asked conversationally. "The saws remember every tree, every splinter, every bone. They remember the taste. And once they've tasted, they hunger for more." He laughed then, a sound like grinding gears. 20 years we fed them. You think they'll stop now? You think you can starve blades that have drunk so deep?" Finch would later report that what happened next defied rational explanation. Silas turned back to the controls, and the circular saws began to speed up, faster and faster, until the entire building shook with their fury. Dust filled the air so thick it was impossible to see or breathe. There was a sound like a ship's mast snapping, a flash of something that might have been lightning, but couldn't have been, not inside a building. When the dust cleared, Silas was gone. Not escaped gone. The only sign of him was a scatter of blood on the saw bed and his asylum clothes, shredded as if they'd been pulled through the cutting mechanism. But that was impossible. The gap between the blade and the bed was barely an inch. No human body could fit through that space, unless... Finch ordered the mill sealed again, this time with iron bars across every entrance and guards posted round the clock. But the damage was done. Word of Silas's impossible disappearance spread, adding supernatural terror to the human horror that already gripped the valley. The execution of Elijah Hartwell was set for January 20th, 1874. As the date approached, Blackwood descended into a kind of collective madness. The very air seemed to thicken with dread, as if the coming event cast shadows backward through time. Strange incidents multiplied with each passing day. Animals refused to enter the forests, backing away with rolling eyes and trembling flanks. Every mill in the county began experiencing mechanical failures, blades cracking without cause, wheels seizing mid-turn, gears stripping their teeth as if chewing on invisible bones. Children throughout the valley spoke of the same nightmare. They were logs tumbling helplessly toward massive, screaming saws. In Portland, Elijah Hartwell sat in his cell with the same unnatural calm he displayed throughout his trial. The stone walls sweated in the January cold, and frost formed on the iron bars, but Elijah seemed immune to the temperature. He spent his days drawing mechanical diagrams on the walls with a piece of charcoal, designing improvements to mill efficiency with the same dispassion he'd shown when discussing his victims. The drawings were remarkably detailed, gear ratios calculated to the third decimal, stress points identified and reinforced, new methods for increasing cutting speed without sacrificing smoothness. Guards reported that he never slept. They would check on him at all hours and find him sitting on his narrow cot, staring at his diagrams or simply gazing at something beyond the walls that only he could see. He ate mechanically, chewing each bite exactly 15 times before swallowing, as if consumption itself was merely another process to be optimized. When Reverend Morgan visited to offer spiritual comfort, Elijah listened politely, his gray eyes never leaving the minister's face. But when Morgan paused in his scripture reading, Elijah's first question was whether the Reverend knew the optimal moisture content for green timber. 18%, he said when Morgan couldn't answer. Below that, the wood becomes brittle. Above it, it molds. Everything has its perfect state for processing, Reverend. Everything. The guards began to dread their shifts. There was something deeply unsettling about Elijah's presence, a wrongness that went beyond his crimes. It was as if he existed, slightly out of phase with the rest of humanity, operating according to laws and logic that no one else could perceive. Even hardened criminals in neighboring cells complained of nightmares when Elijah was near. 3 days before the execution, everything changed. Sheriff Finch was doing his evening rounds when he heard something unprecedented, Elijah Hartwell laughing. Not the mad cackle of his brother, but deep, genuine laughter that seemed to come from some vast space within him. It was the laughter of a man who has finally understood a cosmic joke that no one else can see. "Sheriff," Elijah called out, his voice carrying an unfamiliar warmth. "Come here. I need to tell you something. Something important." Finch approached wearily. The lamplight flickered, casting dancing shadows on the cell walls, making Elijah's mechanical drawings seem to move and shift. In that uncertain light, Elijah's eyes glittered with something that might have been amusement, or might have been something far worse. "You think you understand," Elijah said, leaning forward until his face nearly touched the bars. His breath misted in the cold air, and Finch noticed it smelled faintly of sawdust. "Impossible, as the jail food contained only hardtack and salted fish. You think this was about money, about desperation? You think we were monsters who killed for profit, weren't you?" Finch's hand instinctively moved to his pistol. Elijah's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed too white, too perfect, as if they'd been ground smooth. "We never killed anyone, Sheriff. Not once. Oh, we processed them, cut them, sold them, but kill them? No, that was never necessary." Finch felt ice crystallize in his veins. "What are you saying?" "The mill, Sheriff. The mill's been there longer than Blackwood, longer than Maine, longer than memory." Elijah's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow filled the corridor. "The Penobscot knew. They called it the place where the earth bleeds. Why do you think they avoided that bend in the creek? My father knew too, though he fought it. Fought it for 20 years before it finally claimed him." "You're insane." Finch's voice cracked slightly. "Am I? Then explain Silas. Explain how he traveled 70 miles barefoot in winter. Explain the saws running without power. Explain why every mill in the valley is failing now." Elijah sat back, his chains rattling with a sound like grinding gears. "You think you've stopped it by arresting us, but the mill's still there, still hungry. And hunger, Sheriff, hunger always finds a way to feed." Elijah leaned forward again, and Finch saw that the man's pupils had dilated until his eyes were almost entirely black. "Do you want to know the real secret, Sheriff? Why the lumber was so strong, so straight, so perfect?" Finch found himself nodding despite every instinct screaming at him to flee. "The saws don't just cut timber, Sheriff. They cut everything, past and present, memory and flesh, hope and bone. They take what is and reduce it to what can be used. And once you fed them long enough, once you've given them a taste for something richer than pine." Elijah's chains rattled again as he spread his hands. "They teach you things, show you the patterns hidden in the cutting, the mathematics of reduction, the beauty of complete utilization." "The beauty?" Finch's voice was barely a whisper. "Oh yes. There's beauty in efficiency, Sheriff. In waste becoming resource, in the transformation of the complex to the simple. Every person who went into those saws, they became part of something larger. Their calcium strengthened the homes throughout the valley. Their proteins nourished the forests. Their iron enriched the very soil." He leaned closer, his voice a sibilant hiss. "They didn't die, Sheriff. They were transformed, processed, utilized. Is that not a kind of immortality?" Finch stumbled backward, his hand fumbling for the door. Elijah's laughter followed him, not loud, but somehow penetrating, like the sound of saws shrieking in the distance. That night, Finch couldn't bring himself to go home. Instead, he sat in his office, poring over old records by candlelight. What he found made him question everything he thought he knew. The site of the Hartwell mill appeared in document after document, always associated with disappearances, tragedies, and strange occurrences. In 1682, an entire Puritan family, the Goodwins, had vanished from their farm near that bend in the creek. Their cabin was found intact, supper still on the table, but of the family, parents and 5 children, there was no trace. In 1715, Obadiah Pike had built the first sawmill on that spot. Within a year, he and his entire family had disappeared. The mill was found running, cutting nothing, the blades worn smooth as glass. In 1740, William Sawyer had claimed the land. He lasted just one winter before abandoning the property, telling anyone who would listen that the creek whispered to him at night in voices that weren't quite human. He died 3 months later, speaking of saws that shrieked in his dreams. Even Jedediah Hartwell's death in 1852 took on new significance. The official record stated he'd been found at the base of the wheel, his body crushed. But a margin note in the coroner's report, nearly faded with age, mentioned something else. Body showed signs of partial processing. Flesh abraded in patterns consistent with cutting action. How this occurred with the mill wheel stationary remains unexplained. The morning of January 20th dawned gray and bitter cold. Ice crystals hung in the air like suspended grief, and the sun struggled to penetrate clouds that seemed heavy with more than snow. The gallows had been erected in the Portland jail yard, the fresh pine lumber standing out starkly against the weathered stone walls. Despite the early hour and freezing weather, a crowd of over 400 had gathered. Some came for justice, some for spectacle, and some perhaps hoping that Elijah's death would end the curse that seemed to have fallen over the valley. The crowd was unusually quiet. Where executions typically drew raucous mobs calling for blood, this gathering had the hushed quality of a funeral or a ritual. People stamped their feet against the cold and spoke in whispers, their breath forming ghosts in the frigid air. Many clutched religious symbols, crosses, holy water, prayer beads. Others carried older protections, iron horseshoes, bundles of dried herbs, salt in small leather pouches. At precisely 7:45, the prison doors opened. Elijah Hartwell emerged between 2 guards, and a collective intake of breath rippled through the crowd. He had changed. Where before he'd been merely large, he now seemed vast, as if he'd expanded to fill more space than his body should occupy. His prison clothes hung on him like timber sacks, and his bare feet, he'd refused shoes, left prints in the frost that steamed as if burning. He walked to the gallows with the same steady gait he'd used to walk his mill, each step deliberate and measured. The crowd parted before him like logs before a river current. Some later swore they heard the shriek of saw blades with each footfall, though that was surely impossible. On the scaffold, the hangman, brought specially from Boston, waited with professional calm, though witnesses noticed his hands trembling as Elijah approached. The prisoner had to duck to fit under the crossbeam, and when he stood on the trap, the Newwood groaned ominously. "Any last words?" the sheriff asked, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. Elijah looked out over the crowd, his gray eyes sweeping across the assembled faces like a miller inspecting timber. When he spoke, his voice carried to the farthest edges of the yard without him raising it. "You think this ends with me?" he said. "You think the hunger dies when the feeder is gone? But I tell you now, the saws remember every tree, every bone, every life that passed through them. They remember, and they hunger, and they will call to others as they called to us." He paused, and in that silence everyone present heard it, a distant shriek, like wind through deep ravines or massive blades turning. "The mill will stand empty," Elijah continued, "but not still. Never still. And one day, when the hunger grows too great, when the saws can no longer bear their emptiness, someone will come. Someone will always come because efficiency calls to those who can hear it. Utilization sings to those who understand. And the cutting." He smiled then, a terrible expression that transformed his face into something inhuman. "The cutting never ends." The hangman moved to place the hood over Elijah's head, but the condemned man shook his head. "No. Let them see. Let them remember. Let them know what watches and waits and hungers in the dark." At precisely 8 o'clock, the trap was sprung. Elijah Hartwell dropped, the rope snapping taut with a sound like breaking timber. But as his body fell, every mill in the valley, every single one, from Portland to the Canadian border, suddenly roared to life. In Camden, the old Browning mills began turning though the sluice gates were frozen solid. In Waterville, saw blades that had been separated for cleaning slammed together and began shrieking. In dozens of towns, the sound rose, a cutting, hungry roar that sent people fleeing from their homes, hands pressed to their ears. At the abandoned Hartwell mill, the guards later reported, the building shook as if in an earthquake. The great wheel, despite being chained, spun so fast it threw spray 100 feet into the air, the frozen creek somehow providing impossible torrents of water. The sound from inside was described by one guard as like the earth itself was screaming, and by another as the sound of 1,000 mouths chewing. Windows shattered outward in perfect synchronization. The massive doors, barred and bolted, burst open as if blown by some internal pressure. And from the cutting room came a light. Not the warm glow of fire, but something cold and pale, like moonlight filtered through sawdust. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. At the exact moment the prison clock struck 8:01, marking the minute of Elijah's death, every mill fell silent. Every wheel stopped, every blade stilled. An unnatural quiet settled over the valley, as if the very air was holding its breath. At the gallows, Elijah's body hung motionless, but witnesses swore they saw something impossible in those final seconds. As the mills fell silent, his corpse seemed to collapse inward, as if something essential had been withdrawn. When they cut him down, the body weighed barely half what it should have, and the undertaker reported that the flesh had a strange granular texture, as if it had been partially cut. But the most disturbing discovery came that afternoon, when Sheriff Finch returned to check on the Hartwell mill. The guards were gone, not dead, simply vanished, their rifles left leaning against the walls, their footprints ending abruptly at the threshold. Inside, the mill was immaculate. Every surface had been cleaned, every piece of machinery oiled and adjusted. The saw blades, those massive wheels that had processed so much horror, were polished to a mirror finish, and carved into the wooden floor of the cutting room in letters 3 feet high was a single word: hungry. Finch ordered the mill sealed again, this time with every entrance bricked up solid. But he knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the January wind, that it wouldn't matter. The mill had tasted something richer than timber, and that taste would linger. The saws would remember, and eventually, inevitably, someone would come to feed them again. Because Elijah had been right about one thing: hunger always finds a way. As Finch stood in that empty, too clean cutting room, he heard something that made him flee and never return. From deep beneath the floor, deeper than the basements, deeper than should have been possible, came a sound like massive blades turning, cutting, waiting, always waiting. In the days that followed Elijah's execution, investigators made one final terrible discovery at the Hartwell mill. Hidden beneath the foundation, deeper than the chambers where bodies had been found, was a sub-basement that predated the mill itself. The walls were not colonial construction, but something far older, fitted stones covered in symbols that Dr. Vance, consulted for her archaeological knowledge, identified as pre-Columbian, possibly ancient Native American. In the center of this ancient chamber was a stone, not a millstone or a saw blade, but something that resembled a massive, blunt cutting tool. Carved from a single piece of granite, covered in worn symbols, with grooves that spiraled inward to a central hole that seemed to descend forever into darkness. Around it were offerings, corn, tobacco, and yes, bones. Some animal, some not. This is why they built here, Vance wrote in her final report. The Hartwells didn't bring evil to this place. They were drawn to it, called to it. The mill was just a modern expression of something far older, a hunger that has existed in this spot for centuries, perhaps millennia. The town council, faced with this discovery, made a decision that would be debated for generations. Rather than demolish the mill and risk releasing whatever dwelt beneath it, they sealed it. Every entrance was bricked up. The water wheel was removed and destroyed. The saw blades were broken with sledgehammers, and the pieces scattered in the deepest parts of the Atlantic Ocean. The ancient chamber was filled with cement, tons of it, pumped in until the contractors swore they could pump no more. Then they diverted Blackwood Creek itself, changing its course so that it no longer flowed past the mill. The building, robbed of its water power, stood like a tombstone, slowly being reclaimed by the forest and the sea spray. Blackwood never recovered. Within 5 years, most of the population had moved away, unable to live with the memories and the shame. The telegraph line that was to bring prosperity bypassed the town entirely. By 1880, Blackwood was just a name on old maps, its houses empty, its remaining mills silent. But the stories persisted. Travelers passing through the valley reported strange sounds on foggy nights, like cutting blades, distant but distinct. Hunters avoided the area where the mill stood, claiming their dogs would whine and refused to track near the old creek bed. And every few years, someone would disappear on the old roads, leaving behind only their belongings and a fine dusting of what might have been sawdust. Caleb Thorne, the boy whose discovery had unveiled the horror, lived to be 89. On his deathbed in 1936, he called his granddaughter to his side. "Stay away from Mills, girl," he whispered. "Stay away from old blades and old hungers. Some things, once they get a taste, never stop being hungry." The Hartwells knew that. Lord help them. They knew, and they fed it anyway. Fed it until it owned them, body and soul. He died clutching a small piece of pine bark, as if even in death he needed to remember the difference between timber and what else might be cut. The Hartwell mill still stands, though few know its location now. The forest has reclaimed it, trees growing through its windows, vines covering its walls. Blackwood Creek found its way back despite human intervention, flowing once again past those sealed foundations. And sometimes, locals say, on nights when the fog rolls in thick from the sound, you can hear it. The distant shriek of blades cutting, always cutting. In 1973, exactly 100 years after the Hartwell brothers' arrest, a developer from Boston bought the land, intending to clear it for coastal vacation homes. The bulldozer operator who first approached the mill reported that his machine died just 50 feet from the building. Every piece of equipment they brought suffered the same fate, mechanical failure within sight of those vine-covered walls. The project was abandoned. The land was eventually donated to the state as a nature preserve, with the stipulation that the mill never be disturbed. Official records list it as a historical structure unsafe for public access. The few historians who know its true history prefer it that way, because some hungers, once awakened, never truly sleep. They just wait, patient as stone, for someone foolish enough to feed them again. This mystery shows us that the most terrifying monsters are often human beings driven by greed and circumstance to commit unthinkable acts. Or perhaps it shows us that some places are marked by an evil older than memory, drawing the susceptible into its service. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. Remember, sometimes the things we fear in the dark are nothing compared to what humans are capable of in the light of day. See you in the next video.